you, everyone. Thank you for joining Travel the World with an Investment Career. We've got 4 panelists with us, so I'm going to hand over to them shortly to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about themselves. Before I do that, if you have any questions while we are talking, please do feel free to submit them at any point, and either I will try and hand them on to people as we go, or I will leave around about 5 or 10 minutes for questions at the end. So if you've got questions, just ping them through at any point, and I will collate them and try and pass them on. But now we're going to pass over to the first of our 4 panelists, Alex, who's going to introduce herself and then go through the rest of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lizzie. And hi, everyone. I'm Alex Faye. I work for a company called Lion Trusts as a product development manager. Just to give a bit more information around what I do, I help the company launch new investment funds and also lead strategic projects. One of the key things that we're working on at the moment is sustainability, like a lot of other asset managers at the moment. And so I've been working in the industry for about 13 years now in various countries such as France, Luxembourg, and the UK now. So now I'm going to hand over to Jen, I think.
Hi, I'm Jen Robertson. I work at GIC, which is a Singaporean sovereign wealth fund. I've been here for 2 years, and prior to that was at Wells Fargo Asset Management for 8 years. Prior to that, Transamerica Investment Management for 7 years. So I've been on the buy side going on 18 years now. As you can tell, I'm an American, and I've been living in London for the last 8 years. Recently got my British citizenship just a few months ago. So that has been a cool achievement to have. And then I will pass it over to Orli.
Hi, everyone. My name is Orli Arav. I have about 25 years experience in finance, advisory, strategy roles. My last 16 years I spent in Africa, or living in London, investing in Africa. I specialize in development finance of infrastructure. Sorry, there's a bit of background noise. Apologies. I will move to Richard because I think I need to control here the background noise for a second.
Sure, no problem. My name is Richard. I work at Janus Henderson. I've been on the buy side for 18 years now. I manage a global technology fund, which means I invest in technology stocks around the world, predominantly in the US, but also in China, and trying to find the next Apples and Googles and Facebooks and Ubers in India, Southeast Asia, in Africa, and Latin America as well. That's taken me over to Hong Kong to live and also to travel to many bits of the world, trying to seek out those future winners of tomorrow.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for your introductions. So I'm going to jump straight in, and I'm going to start with asking where you all began your careers and whereabouts that has led you to live in over your various tenures. So Jen, do you want to kick us off by answering that question?
Sure. So I grew up in California. I went to school on the East Coast of the US and promptly returned back to California after the East Coast winters. So I started my career in Los Angeles and was there for quite a long time before moving to London. I grew up in a place called Manhattan Beach, which, if anybody knows where Manhattan Beach is, I often get the question of why do you live in cold, rainy London? But it was travel actually that attracted me to living abroad.
And Richard, you mentioned that you have lived in Hong Kong. Can you tell us a little about that and some of the other places that it sounds like your job's taken you to?
Yeah, I've worked out of Hong Kong, New York, Edinburgh, a bit closer to home, a bit colder, and yeah, no, it's really interesting the different work environments that you sort of come across. Such buzzing cities like Hong Kong and New York, fantastic places to live. Edinburgh, has its wonderful sort of university town. So I think some really exciting places that my career has taken me to work, and a lot of friends that I've managed to establish in those places over the years too. So kind of home from homes now.
And Alex, you are, I suppose, also living in London, but you are not from London originally, as I understand. Like Orli, do you want to tell us a little about how you found that experience as being an inward traveller?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's so I've been in London for 8 years now, but I started in Luxembourg a few years ago, and I think it was a really good starting point because it's very international as well. So I could already interact with some I had British colleagues and things like that, and it was a good stepping stone before coming to the a bigger financial place here in London. Yeah, I think it's definitely a cultural change. It took me 8 years to adjust. I'm not sure I'm here, I'm there yet, but still working on it. But as Richard said, after a few years, you just end up turning, home away from home into your real home. And that's what's happening for me right now.
That home away from home feeling sounds like it's something we can all relate to and we've all gone through. Orli, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you have found that experience of settling into new places, creating new networks and new friends, something that Richard touched upon, and perhaps being education and working within different cultures, communities, a little bit about that experience? Orli, you're still muted.
Sorry, I just want to say for some of the people who are listening today, I actually started my first time in London as a student. So I had a scholarship to come from the Tel Aviv University. I grew up in Israel, and actually I'm calling from Tel Aviv now on work from home arrangement for summer. But I came on a scholarship to do a PhD in economics at LSE. And then I liked London, but went back home to work. We're lucky enough to be sent to PwC for learn about project finance, which is my expertise today. Liked it a lot, fell in love with London at that time. Had to go home for different reasons, but found myself 16 years ago back to London, and kind of with one foot in Africa. So as I said, you know where you start, you never know where you end. I think if anyone would have told me that I would spend most of or a good chunk of my life trotting the globe and working in Africa, I would probably say this is not what I had in mind when I started my life. So lots of, and I think it's an experience to come from a different culture. Definitely the Israeli culture is very far from the British culture. So you get a culture shock, and I think language-wise that was fine. There was no issues, but the culture was different. So I think you get to know people, and I think the nice part about London is so international that you can always kind of communicate with different people. From a network perspective, a lot of comes from work. But today, again, looking fast forward for many years, there's a lot of apps that help you create networks. So it depends what's your interest. I'm part of the Conduit Club, which is social entrepreneurs, and you have a network there, and you can join hundreds of meetups on this app, whatever topic in the world you can imagine. You can find a lot of people who are interested to do something together.
Jen, I saw you nodding along there as Orli was talking about sort of difference in culture. And the phrase that I'm going to pick up on from her and pass on to you was she talked about she didn't envision herself trotting the globe when she signed up to this career. Was that something that you saw yourself doing when you moved towards investment management, given that it perhaps is not something people would immediately look to as a career which provides that opportunity? Or was it a pleasant surprise when you realized that things were changing?
It was a pleasant surprise, I would say. I knew that investment management involved a lot of business analysis and a lot of financial statement analysis, but I didn't realize how in understanding those businesses and the opportunities that they had, that you really needed to be on the ground in some of the geographies to really see the opportunity itself. For example, if a company, say it's a consumer staples company talking about they're going to grow in Africa, once you're on the ground in Africa and you see how challenging from a logistical perspective that is, you start to get a much better understanding the challenge that will bring and who has an advantage and who has a disadvantage. So I think a lot of it can be dependent on if you work at a company that has a good travel budget for its analysts. And I think that's something that's important to ask if you're interviewing, is how supportive are you of travel, particularly international trips? Because I think that that really helps to broaden your own knowledge about the industry and sectors you're covering. When I was nodding in agreement with Orli, it was also just about the language was never an adjustment when I moved here, but there were many lost in translation moments as an American in British culture and vice versa. And I think for Americans in particular, it takes a while to get used to the politeness of English culture, because Americans tend to tell it like it is. In general, I'm speaking in generalizations, but then sometimes I'd walk away from a meeting thinking, oh, that went great. My ideas are really received well. And the English person there would say, no, they didn't really like that idea. So there's definitely lost in translation moments when you live abroad, even though you have a common language. But yeah, I think it's so important in understanding businesses and industries just to be on the ground and see the cultures in action and see how a Japanese automaker has its factory set up relative to a Detroit automaker, relative to a Chinese company that's playing more of a catch up. It's fascinating to see it, and you can't put that in a model and you can't put that in a report, but it's just important to feel it.
Richard, obviously you spent quite a lot of time trying to find these gems within countries all over the world. So you've almost certainly had similar or comparable experiences. Did you find that this was something that you struggled to communicate to the powers that be in your company in terms of the importance of travel? Or did you find most of your directors or your superiors, perhaps when you were younger, were receptive to you traveling and saw the importance in it?
I was very lucky, and I'm sure many people on this panel would have had this. I had some great mentors that really invested in sort of teaching me the skills that I needed, and one of those was very much on the ground research. I very much agree with what Jen was talking about. And very early on in my career, I was basically just sent out for months at a time to Asia to go and meet small cap tech companies in Korea and Taiwan and China. And many times it was the first time a foreign investor had sort of ever met them, and they weren't quite sure what you were doing. You were coming to take over the company or whatever you were doing. They didn't really understand why a foreign investor would be turning up at their doors, and fairly intimidating for a 22, 23-year-old to be doing that. But incredible learning curve, and you really sort of in-depth sort of learning how technology works, the industry works, how investment research works and analysis works. You've got to get in the deep end, you've got to get in the weeds, you've got to get out there.
And Alex, you mentioned that you've spent a significant amount of time abroad, and particularly when you were in Switzerland, in that very international pool. Did you ever find that was particularly challenging or perhaps particularly enjoyable, exposing yourself to a whole range of different cultures, different communication styles that might, to some people, be a challenge?
Yes, so I think the thing about Luxembourg, I think the main challenge is usually it's been my experience for any new country, is like the first year when you arrive somewhere, because we're all talking about how important it is to have a network and how interesting it is to build that home away from home, but it takes some time. And then I think it takes some time to understand the various cultures. It takes some time to actually settle somewhere as well. So I think that's, from my perspective, is the first year is always kind of the most challenging one, but it's also where you actually get out of your comfort zone, and that's where you learn the most, because you actually have to build those relationships. You have to rely on your soft skills. You have to basically turn yourself into a chameleon to a certain extent, and then engage with the various cultures, understand how they function, not be afraid to make mistakes, because obviously you will make them. You will say the wrong things. And a very interesting one I think I made, it's just a language thing. So I did my MBA in the US, and then there are a few slight things that I got wrong, I think, from my perspective. I came to London, and I was speaking the slang that I learned in the US, expecting it would just translate. And I had a few instances where I went to an event with my boss. It was like a gala event, and he was wearing so in what I learned were suspenders in the US, but apparently in British English they're not called suspenders. Suspenders are more for women. So I was very happy to say how much I loved his suspenders, you know, around the table, and people were like, mm-hmm. And then he pretended he didn't hear anything. I was like, Matt, you know, I really love the colors you choose for them. And he was like, that's not how we call them in this country. And I'm like, okay, sorry, my bad. So there are a few things like that where you feel really embarrassed for a second, but then they're all learning opportunities.
I feel for you so much in that circumstance. I can't imagine. I really hope someone, well, maybe gently teased you about it early enough rather than letting you carry on for too long. But it's a great anecdote. But at least
it's the same with parents, isn't it? If you have parents in the US, it's different than the UK. There's few words that you can use very wrongly.
Orli, it actually takes me on. I was going to ask about the value of languages in terms of an investment career. If you are lucky enough to come from somewhere where English is your first language, it can make you lazy from learning a foreign language point of view. How important do you think it is from, I suppose, from also a point of view of wanting to show that you're interested in learning another language, another culture? How valuable is that in terms of speaking other languages or including that as part of your education or a skill set amongst the soft skills that Alex was talking about?
I think it's extremely important, and I was extremely lucky that actually my mother tongue is French. So I spoke French from my first day, or the first day I could speak. Then I learned Hebrew because I was living in Israel, which I never thought I will ever use outside of Israel. And again, found out that it's quite helpful sometimes. Then I learned English at school, but coming to the UK, which is not my first language, it took a long time to actually be able to express myself well in English. So I would say for people who English is not their first language, really learn how to express yourself in a sense of reading, but writing. Writing is the most difficult part. And I found a lot of times that in the early days of my career, it was very difficult for me to write something. And there are words that sounds the same, but they have completely different meaning if you put an A or an E to it, and good luck. And how do I remember? Now I know that there are words I check on Google every time I write them, even though I'm sure by now, after 16, 17 years, I know how to write them. I always check like then and then, every time I will put the A or the E wrong. I know now the difference, but I will continue and make this sometimes as a mistake, especially when I try to write very fast. So my advice is first master the language, the key language that you will need to use, but understanding also other languages is very helpful. And I think for somebody who works in Africa, I'm, as I said, very lucky that I speak 2 of the key languages. I would love to learn more Arabic, which I refused learning when I was a kid. My parents both came from Egypt, so they speak Arabic. I refused to learn the language from one obscure reason or another, and I regret it until today.
And Jen, we've already, well, Alex has mentioned soft skills. Orli very clearly, again, kind of navigated that point of how you can bring in other skills you've got to complement the skills that you have, and then maybe more create a job to fit you, what you want and what you can do with it. Do you think that's something that you managed to do? You mentioned earlier you have a passion for travel. Do you think that you can bring soft skills as well as hard skills into a job, and how do you recommend someone does that, particularly with travel in mind and a traveling job?
Yeah, I mean, I think soft skills are very important to have to bring into a role such as investment management, whether it's internally, how you're navigating, you know, the different environments of the offices that you're working in, whether it's talking to the corporate companies that you're investing in, whether it's going abroad and talking to the people within your office or within your company but are in a different office. So I have to navigate Singaporean culture, I navigate British culture, and then also American culture, which is more easy to do because that's where I'm from. But even now, it is a mental reset. But I think what people get wrong about investment management is just thinking that it's so quantitative focused. Whereas, yes, that's very important to underwrite investments and to have your models be tight and whatnot. But I think the way that you stand out in this industry is through your soft skills and through the relationships that you have, because there's a lot of money chasing a lot of assets out there. And ultimately, the way that you make a difference and the way that you stand out to the people that you're talking to is through the relationship that you've established with them. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate that. Even people who've been in the industry for decades, they might not appreciate that. So I think it's really important to succeed in this industry to be as well-rounded as you can be. And then just, yeah, when you get to travel and when you get to go to different cultures, just see different cultures, just being appreciative. So I was one of the lazy Americans that didn't become fluent in another language. I studied Spanish, I can get by in Spanish. But whenever I go to a different country for work, I always make sure that I can say, greetings in the local language and how are you and count. And I think the corporations that I speak to really appreciate just that small effort. So even if you aren't fluent in many languages, I envy Orli's fluency and Alex has a lot of language knowledge as well. But even if not, just making a little bit of effort goes a long way.
Richard, I saw you sort of vigorously nodding at that earlier part of that statement. Do you want to tell us a little bit about maybe the fun side of getting to live abroad and travel with your work and meet interesting new people? Sell it to us more than people probably don't need. But
yeah, no, I think it's the most undersold bit of the job that, from a very early age, you get the opportunity to sit down for an hour with some of the most interesting people in the world doing, particularly in technology, doing some of the most exciting things in some really exciting countries. And they basically just have to answer your questions for an hour. And you can ask them whatever you want, go in any direction you want. It's incredibly, exciting, invigorating, intellectually stimulating for anyone who's curious about the world, how it all gets put together. I think fund management is such a really interesting role that, you really have to, take a huge amount of information and distill it into something that kind of creates a narrative that you can sort of get behind and understand and invest behind. But you get the opportunity to go out and meet these incredibly interesting people. So I started going out to China in 2004, and just seeing every year, going there 3 or 4 times and seeing the evolution of China in the last 17 years, and the Chinese internet industry that's pretty much defined my career has been incredibly exciting. And to the point made earlier, you can't understand it unless you see it on the ground. You could turn up to offices and suddenly there's 1,000 delivery bikes outside with e-commerce packages, or suddenly they get 4G and you're going from the airport in a taxi and he's watching a 4G video being streamed to his phone as he's trying to navigate Beijing traffic at 95 miles an hour. You understand that it's taken off, and now I'm doing that in India, I'm doing that in Latin America. I don't think there are many, industries or jobs that provide you with that opportunity, and especially at an early age. Normally you get to do that 20 years down the line after you put in some incredible amount of hard work and hours. You get to do that very early on in an investment career.
have there been anything which any of you, I'm going to start with Alex, but I suspect you've all got some interesting nuggets of information to share on this, that you have perhaps struggled with or found difficult, whether it's culture within an office, or again, alluding a little more to perhaps to that change of environment when you do move to a new country and have to kind of start again. Alex, do you want to start us off and tell us if you've got any, I suppose, learning curves? I think your mic's still off, Alex. You're still muted.
Yeah, I think as I was saying earlier, it's very much getting out of your comfort zone. So I'm kind of borderline. Let's say that, when you're uncomfortable, it's easier to kind of crawl back home and then try not to leave your house because you're like, I don't know anyone and it's going to be difficult. But just kind of making that mental effort to actually engage with people like that you wouldn't naturally, and just get out there more often. So I think when I moved to London, the first thing I did was to move in with people. I didn't want to live on my own, for instance. And then in the office, I engaged with pretty much anyone who would be happy to talk to me. And then, you know, go to the pub and just learn about the culture and just, you know, I wasn't a pub person before, but then realized that a lot of the social interactions were happening at the pub. So basically changing your usual ways of doing things to embrace the culture you're moving to. The like social interaction, for instance, in the French environment is very much around lunch and food. So, you know, when I was told that, you know, eating is cheating when we went to the pub was a bit, it was a bit difficult for me because I was like, are we going to eat at some point? And then eventually there still was no food at 9 p.m. But now I've learned my lesson and just eat before I join them at the pub. But then, yeah, things like that, where you basically embrace the culture you move to, even if it might not be natural at the beginning. And then in a office environment, it will be a similar, I think, experience where it takes a bit of time. It's not going to be like, it's not going to work overnight. So you need to make that extra effort to actually build those relationships, even when, you know, it doesn't seem like people are very, when you move to a new environment, they already have their own networks of people. And then, you know, when I moved to London, people already had their friends in the office and their colleagues. So you actually have to be the person who is going to make that extra effort to engage with people and get to know them and see how you could work with them better. So I think it's, yeah, that kind of relationship building skills. Like this is for me the key thing, especially if you don't feel like it, sometimes you still have to do it.
Orli, do you have something to add? I feel like you do.
Yeah, well, I think I relate very much to what Alex said about the food and the drinking. It was a culture shock because we didn't drink well, now they drink, but when I grew up in Israel, it was not common to go to a pub or drink. And when I started my PhD, so I was very, very young, and everybody just went to the pub. And they opened the pub at 12 at the midday, and they went to drink in the middle of school. I said, "Oh, this is really weird." But I think, but if I try to paraphrase, yes, adapt to some of the culture. I want to point to something completely different, which is gender. I think, you know, in our world, especially in some areas that we work in, some countries, they're not used to see a woman manager show up and tell them what to do. And that's something, you know, I've been probably many years of my life been kind of, this was the characteristic of what I need to do. And I have like 10 men in the meeting and I show up and then they think I'm going to make coffee or something. And I correct them that this is, maybe they can make coffee, but not me. And I think just, you know, I get upset about it, but I also try to be respectful of the culture and not to say, no, I will not speak, or I will, but understand that sometimes this, you know, I need to make these changes small by little. Here I'm translating from Hebrew for you, small by small. And then, you know, I don't take it personally anymore, but I also don't agree to the behavior, but I need to be careful how I do business, especially if I speak to ministers or other people. I can't just tell them, okay, I don't care what you say or how you say it. Maybe one anecdote, one of my colleagues, she went to Egypt with my boss at that time, and she was very vocal and very kind of put all her views in front of the CEO of a big company. And the other one looked at my boss and said, "Why do you let her even speak? She should be in the kitchen or something." And so, you know, if somebody would tell me that, I probably will react, but also sometimes just think about the culture. And you know, unfortunately, some places still need to be more advanced about equality.
So that's why we've got GAIN in terms of we want to encourage women into these workplaces. So with that, I'm going to throw that back on to Richard. From a man's perspective, I don't know if you can cast, well, not so much from a man's perspective, but do you think that with the change in demographic of people working with the investment industry, do you see as someone who's worked doing this for a long time, any difficulties with women traveling to places where perhaps, as Orli talked about, culturally, we are not necessarily expecting to do the same things as men in certain circumstances?
Yes, I mean, we're working in the technology industry, and then in many countries where, you know, to Orli's point, some very different attitudes towards kind of what a woman's role would be. You know, that's something that unfortunately I have seen many instances of over the years. I mean, the only thing that I can say positively is that, you know, things really are changing, and I'd probably say in a sort of an accelerated pace. There's so much attention towards that issue now, so much pressure from shareholders on companies that, you know, and, you know, some unfortunately sometimes forced or some very nasty things that have happened. There's very bad cultures in companies. There's so much focus more on this today, so much more fantastic female investors going to these companies. The attitudes are changing. There's a lot more work to be done, and particularly in the technology industry, but progress is being made.
You're on mute.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you. I'm just going to say special thank you, Richard, for answering that, because I feel like I slightly threw that at him as our sole male panelist. So thank you, Richard. Jen, you recently moved, I understand, to working within the Singaporean Wealth Fund, Sovereign Wealth Fund. How have you found that in terms of a cultural change? Because there is also a difference with working within something like a sovereign management to working in a more traditional investment management role, or perhaps a fund management role like Richard. Could you tell us a little more about that experience?
Yes, I mean, there's a cultural aspect to that, and then there's also just how my role has slightly changed. So from a cultural perspective, I'm still learning, and it's been a challenge to not be able to be in Singapore more than one time. I'm looking forward to being able to go back, but in general, I would say Singaporean culture is very polite. But one of the fascinating things about Singapore is it's one of the, you know, to use the old-fashioned term of third world to first world, it's one of the few countries that made that jump in a generation. And the way that they were able to do that was they had an excellent civil service. So there's excellence expected of workers, whether it's in civil service, whether it's at the Singaporean Sovereign Wealth Fund. There's just a very high bar in order to get, I would say, to the next level and to the next level beyond that. It's a very good culture in terms of, you know, it's very kind, and people, they actually care about the culture, which a lot of companies don't anymore, because most companies are focusing so much on costs that a lot of times the culture and building the culture and retreats and stuff like that are easily cut out. So they still care about that, and that's very important. And I really appreciate that, being from different places over the last, 16 years that didn't care about that as much. I would say from a role perspective, what's really fascinating about being part of a sovereign wealth fund is we don't disclose what our AUM is, but it's a lot. And so anytime there's an IPO, anytime there's a private deal, you are basically the first point of call. And so the access to executives that you get at a company like GIC is pretty mind-blowing. And it's something that I didn't even appreciate when I joined. And then suddenly I realized, okay, I'm going to be working on a lot more deals than I used to, because where I was before, even an IPO, we would just try to play it when it came to market. Whereas when you're with a sovereign wealth fund, you get an early look on a lot of these things. And that's quite fascinating. And it's definitely different. And the relationship aspect is also very important, because sometimes it's management teams that are deciding how they're going to allocate the deal. And part of the way to differentiate yourself is just building a rapport with them. So yeah, the cultural side of Singapore, or of GIC, is fascinating, and it's a very inclusive culture. Still navigating around some of the politeness, which is, I feel like I was a little bit more ready for that being in the UK for a while. And then just also the different role when you have a big amount of AUM behind you.
Alex, you touched upon the dreaded C word, COVID, which has obviously changed how most people are working at the moment, and perhaps will, for the foreseeable future, change how we operate. Alex, how have you found working in a time of COVID? Has it affected travel you might have done otherwise? And how has it changed how you might work going forward, given things have seem to have taken a drastic change?
I think in my case, the way I travel is a bit different from Jen and Richard, because it's mainly to represent my company at conferences or internal meetings. So obviously everything has stopped now, and I think a lot of they're realizing that you don't really have to. Maybe for the major events and conferences, eventually we'll resume travel, but then for the rest, I think it's going to end up being internal meetings, and they're going to use it maybe as an opportunity to reduce travel expenses for us. I think, so I think it'll be slightly different. I think than the experience that Jen and Richard might have, because it's not as essential for me to travel. And I think I think someone had a question around that, because my company is a small asset manager. It's more potentially the opportunities are more around relocating. If, for instance, I want to move to a sales job and be based in Europe, maybe I can apply for things like that. So that's how I would be able to move around within my job. If that makes sense.
Alex, can you talk on that a little bit? Because I was actually hoping to move towards that. I think Sophie has asked a question about the opportunity to travel within a small boutique firm relative to that of a bigger company. And as you've already mentioned, each of you actually has had different travel opportunities, whether it's been looking at individual holdings, whether it's been going meeting clients who are abroad, or in Orli's case, being, it seems, in many places and doing lots of things I mean, it sounds like the amount of travel that's happened between you is extraordinary. How do you think that travel is broken up between different sizes and types of companies?
I think so. When I started working for a big French bank, and that was pretty much my assumption was, because of the number of employees and number of various offices, it would be really easy to move from one office to the other, and then and relocate maybe every year if I wanted to. So that's kind of how I built the first relationship to move to Luxembourg from Paris. So that was actually quite good from that perspective. And then I moved to another smaller boutique asset manager, and it took a bit more time because you don't have that many opportunities because it's smaller to move from offices to offices. So it takes a bit longer, I would say, but it's just because of the type of job I'm doing. So if you're in marketing, product sales, you need to find the right jobs to be able to relocate. But I think if you're in, an investment manager, an analyst, it'll be way different. It doesn't matter because you would need to travel for your job anyway.
So I'm actually going to pass over that same question to both Orli and to Richard, one after the other, or and ask if you again could talk a little bit more on how you think COVID has and will change the future of work with or without travel, and then the opportunities for travel following on from that, given different roles that you might occupy within the finance space.
Okay, if I was just looking at some things. I can give a nice example. On 2019 and 2020, on average, I had 40 trips per year. And I can tell you that since COVID, I had 2. So that's how my travel plan has changed before and after. That's one example. I think I want to echo what all my colleagues on this panel said. There's nothing, you can't make an investment without meeting the people you're going to invest in. Whatever you invest in, infrastructure, consumer goods, even if you're just manages the portfolio, you in the end depend on the people to execute whatever they say on the paper that you are analyzing. So we need this, even if we do it now on these means of communication through Teams, Zooms, etc. You still need to meet the people. So I think in the future we will maybe, before I could travel for a meeting for 2 days 12 hours for a meeting of 2 days because, yeah, everybody goes. But now I think if somebody tells me 12 hours for a 2-day meeting, no, let's try and see as much as we can to do it over these type of means, and then keep the maybe 2-3 last day of negotiations in a full forum, or vice versa. First do the first meeting in person to get to know who is the person behind the screen, and then when I get to get some sort of understanding who I'm dealing with, it's much easier to continue a rapport that started in, let's call it real life, versus the screen life.
Yeah, I think a couple of really important points made there. That I think when you think about sort of the bigger companies and the smaller companies, particularly from some investment analyst point of role, there's puts and takes there. So when you work for a bigger organization, they're more likely to have investment analysts on the ground in different regions. So you won't necessarily get that travel opportunity because they've got someone looking at Chinese autos. So as an auto analyst, you're not going to go over there. You're just going to be looking at an area over here. If you work in distribution, again, they're going to have distribution people on the ground in these various geographies. At a smaller place, maybe that's much more centralized and they're all in London or New York. And so actually you do need to go to these places. And then as Orli said, this is a people business at the end of the day. So I think certainly from an investment analysis point of view, you're going to have to keep getting out there and meeting people. But I do think, from, as you get more senior, you have to sort of launch, see your clients, make sure that they're happy with your fund's performance, raise more assets from them. That's fine when you know those people, you've met them many times in the real world, as Orli put it, but, and you can continue that conversation virtually. So I think those trips maybe get less and less. But, no one's going to hand you a check for $100 million or $1 billion from some Chinese sovereign fund unless you actually get on a plane out to Beijing. And so those new relationships are always going to have to be fostered in the real world and involve traveling. So, I think there's sort of many different caveats rather than just one answer to, are we going to travel more or less after COVID?
I would just add that the one thing I would look for if I was trying to find a position and whether or not people were open to travel, I have noticed that the more concentrated a portfolio is, the more likely, in my experience, that company is supportive of travel. Because if you're running a book that has 40 names within it or 40 holdings, and each holding is a significant chunk and can significantly contribute to performance, whereas some funds that might hold 300 or 400 stocks, you don't necessarily need to be on the ground because you're a little bit more nimble, and the impact of one particular position can be a lot smaller. So in my experience, some of the more concentrated funds tend to support travel, and the ones that are also long-term focused. But again, I've never worked at a hedge fund, so I wouldn't exactly know how they think about things.
I mean, that's actually in itself quite an interesting diversion into then the different strategies that you find within different funds. So perhaps that's not a question when we've got 15 minutes left and we're meant to be talking about travel. But that being said, if all of you have traveled extensively, like we've said, some of you have relocated, some of you have traveled to see different positions, to get to see different places and meet different positions within portfolios or different clients. And there's a big differentiation between the two. But do any of you have particular stories or I suppose things that you might recommend about targeting one or t'other, or perhaps you have not found there is a huge difference if you are looking to do one of those routes in particular, move abroad versus travel with your work? Like, how do you found those?
I'm happy to give it a go, because I think if I look at the continent I work in, I never lived properly in Africa, and I do think that that's something I miss. From various reasons it didn't happen. I only spent recently like 2 months in Nairobi, and I would say that, to understand the continent, and if I had the opportunity, I would have probably should have lived there for a year or 2 or 3. I did the other model of living in London, traveling in and out, and some of these have been like almost every 2 weeks, but from a personal choice. But you don't get to know the kind of the environment the same as if you are coming in and out. There are a lot of pros and cons. Africa is 50-something countries, so where do you place yourself? And sometimes that's why London is a good place to be. You can cover the region easily from one of these jurisdictions. But I do think that I tell a lot of young people I speak to that if they are passionate about a certain region, living there, especially if when you are young and you have like less other commitment and you can do it, it's a great way to really get to know the people, create a personal network, and build something for the future.
I'd massively echo that. I mean, looking back with the sort of the hindsight of being very old now, I would have massively regretted not taking the opportunity to live abroad for some period of time, especially in your 20s. I mean, it's so much fun. And then, and the traveling too, some of the best years were, you're lucky working in investment management, you tend to get fairly well paid. And you have the opportunity to see the world, travel, extend some of your work trips, get a free hotel room, things like that, get a free flight. I used to fly my girlfriend, who's my now wife, out to Japan for 3 days or something. And we just have an absolute ball. It's so much fun. So make the most of it. And it's one of the few industries and jobs that gives you the opportunity to do that.
Did any or all of you foresee getting to do as much travel as you do now when you first signed up for investment management? I know, Jen, you said it was a pleasant surprise, the opportunity to relocate. But for example, Alex, when you moved to Luxembourg, I think you said it was Luxembourg straight away, did you then foresee having to travel a lot within Europe, or was that the opportunity to live somewhere different that really attracted you to that?
Yeah, it was definitely the latter for me. I've always been passionate about, traveling and other cultures and things like that. So, and I knew that if it didn't work, I could always go back home. So there was no fear that, especially when you're young, initially you're like, can I do it? But actually, there's no downside to trying something new, because you can always go home. Paris will always be there eventually for now. If I decide to go back. So and initially it wasn't going to be, I studied in the US, and then when I came back, I pretty much looked anywhere I could go to, and then Luxembourg ended up being the job opportunity that came up, really. And I started in 2008, so not the best time to start in this industry. So we were still hiring in Luxembourg, and I ended up just moving there. And then after 3 years, I was like, so should I just stay or try something else? And then, you just look at new opportunities. I didn't have any commitment at the time. So it was more about, what kind of job do I want to do? How can I maintain that kind of international environment? Be with different cultures, use my languages, and then looking for new opportunities. And when I moved to London, I was in sales, because being in sales, you get to travel the country quite a lot. So I got to engage with various bits of the UK and got to know the country quite well. So yeah, for me, it's definitely about my own aspirations and getting the right opportunities to match what I wanted to get out of my work experience and personal experience.
So actually, Bella has chipped in with a very timely question, asking, first of all, she thanks you all for doing this, and then she asked what we would recommend for a soon-to-be graduate looking to get her first job abroad without necessarily speaking these languages fluently. And she's alluded primarily to European cities. But I don't know if any of you have any particular nuggets of wisdom. Jen, perhaps you would like to chip in here?
My husband and I have talked about where else we would live if we weren't in the UK, and would we go to a place where English was not the primary language? And the answer is yes, but in our mind, it would be very helpful and an easier transition if everyone spoke English as well. So if they spoke their native language or the local language, and then also knew English, so that opens up a ton of opportunities. But I think for me, the most important thing would just be trying to figure out what the diversity of each city is. Is it mostly drawing, within Madrid, is it mostly drawing people from within Spain that are living there, or in Berlin, are they mostly drawing Germans, but then also a big expat community? So I would try to look into how big the expat community is, if you can try to get a feel for it. Because one of the things that is really helpful when you're adjusting to a new country is to have a blend of trying to become friends with people who are from that country, born and raised, and then also being tapped into expats either from your home country or a similar country. So when we were first moved over here, Australians and Californians are quite similar in their approaches to life. And so it helped to hear an Australian's perspective on adapting to England. And but it can also be very tempting to only plug into expats. So just try to have as much of a balance as you can. But I think that English is not too much of a barrier now, but it is harder, I think, when you do relocate to a country where the primary language is not English. So I think I admire Richard for going to Hong Kong, and I think those are big moves, and they do have big expat communities as well. But it's trying to get the local flavor combined with people who are familiar with where you're from too. And I would also, the last tidbit I would say is, even if you're on just a year-long rotation, don't tell any local people in the city that you're only there for a year. Because I found when we first moved here, we thought we were only here for 3 years. And we said, oh yeah, we're going to give it 2 or 3 years. And a lot of Londoners naturally were just like, they're going to move soon. Don't really want to invest the time. Completely understandably, because now we've become those people where we're like, oh, they're on a year-long rotation. I don't know how much effort I want to put in, because it's hard when people move, and you learn that like you have these friendships, and it's hard because you're likely never going to be in the same city at the same time again. So those are my 2 pieces of advice.
I want to build on it and kind of give maybe a bit of a different angle, because I was thinking of moving to Germany, and definitely Germany is not an easy language. German is not an easy language also to learn. And I think the first thing I was checking was first the company that I was working with, how many people could speak English and how do they do business? Because if I need to learn the business language and the external language in order to perform, this is much too hard. And I think this is kind of one of for me, the constraint, because then you spend 6-7 months looking at everybody trying to figure out what word did they say, and that's really difficult. So a lot of international companies will do most of their business in English, and then you can at least work-wise start to communicate, and then you need to stop your brain of speaking English or whatever language you speak and start talking the local language. And I think that's kind of how to handle it, and understand also how much this job requires the local language, because otherwise that's one of the reasons I personally didn't take that role, because I said I can't deal with speaking German all day at work, learning it, and then trying to speak the German outside. So it had to be something that, so a lot of time I tell people, if that's what you want, try to go to international organizations. The key language would be English, or if you're a French speaker, French, and then learn the other languages and invest in it actively.
I'd only add, there's been a focus on kind of the working environment, but remember, when you move somewhere, you're living there as well. So, I've been to China a gazillion times, but then, I got E. coli poisoning a couple of years ago at Alibaba's headquarters, and despite sort of embarrassing myself, vomiting everywhere, you end up in a hospital with a bunch of people who only speak Chinese and don't speak any English. And that's where it really hits you that you do not speak the local language, and it's really scary. And the only other thing I'd say is that, I think for all students who look to apply to investment management, it's been alluded to before on the call, the hard skills, modeling, financials, things like that can all be taught, and you will be taught that. It's the soft skills, it's that curiosity, that sort of willingness to go out there and challenge yourself that we're looking for. And I think anyone who can demonstrate that by going to live somewhere else, to challenge themselves where they don't speak English, take yourself out of the comfort zone. During your university studies, post your university studies, before your university studies, don't just go and sit on a beach. Do that as well. It's fun, but then go and challenge yourself as well. I think that's going to be really important to a potential employer, that they think, okay, I actually have some confidence this person can be challenged and can rise to the challenge rather than being put off and scared.
I think that's all. I mean, what interesting things to hear from each of you as well with such great experience. I can see we've got one more Q&A. Bella's asked one more question, which is, do you have advice for finding graduate roles that won't mind you not speaking the language? So I will ask someone to answer that if anyone's got any particular thoughts on finding a role that wouldn't which means that you don't have to speak the local language. I feel like, Orli, you already touched on that with working perhaps with an international company that mainly operates in English. Does anyone else have any salient thoughts on that particular thing?
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And also because on the website, they would usually, when you do rotations and things, they would mention whether they would send you abroad or whether the assignment would be, some of it would be based abroad. So it's definitely do that. And I think it's not just the French, but I have a few friends working in internal audits as well in the big banks, or being trained into becoming internal auditors. And they tend to also be asked to travel around quite a bit to assess the various offices. So that's also a really good entry point if you like traveling.
Or turn it around to your advantage, go and find companies that are selling into a market where you speak the language. And so actually you have an advantage over the people who are local who can't speak English.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It's great advice.
Interesting way of looking at it. This is why he runs a global investment fund. So we're really basically run out of time, which I'm really upset about. But I'm going to finish by asking each of you to answer, it's not even one, it's kind of a double question, which is, firstly, what is your favorite part of your job in terms of not just telling me if it's modeling or, how is that tied in with the experience travel has added to that? And then lastly, if you have a top tip of anything that might be particularly useful for any of our gals looking to go into investment. And then, so if we go the same way that we went round when you first introduced yourself, and then I'm going to pass back over to Vicky. So Alex, can you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of, let's start with the top tip. I would say just get out of your comfort zone. There's no downside risk of, it's just an experience that's going to be part of your life and you'll keep it forever. And in terms of my favorite thing about my job is the focus on, having an international experience, being quite curious about cultures means that I can bring something very different to the way we create new products. So I'm passionate about innovation and thinking differently about things. So that actually helps quite a lot to come up with different perspectives on things. And I think I wouldn't have had that had I not tried to get outside my own culture at one point.
I would say favorite part of my job is you're just learning every day. Like, you have to have a very inquisitive mind to be in investments, and you have to question things, and you have to just want to learn, and the markets give you feedback every single day on how you're doing at that. And I find that very rewarding. I would say, like, for me, it's exciting when I wake up in the morning to see what news flow is happening, or when it's earnings season, which it is now, just seeing how these companies are reporting, what is changing about the models, especially in COVID, what's going on with the businesses, how are they projecting out for the next year. I find this all very interesting to learn. I would say the top tips, God, there's a lot. But one is listen. When you're young, just try to really listen, because you are, like some people have alluded to, you're sitting before some executives that have been in the business for decades, and just try to really hear what they're saying. A lot of people can go in trying to show what they know in a meeting through the questions they ask. But instead, ask open-ended questions and see what they're hitting upon and see how they're deciding to address it. And then I would say maintain your curiosity, always be curious, and don't get jaded, because over time it's so easy to become jaded and negative in this industry or in any industry or just with life. And your attitude to your work and your life in general is the biggest differentiator that you have relative to your peer group.
Cool. I do asset management, but my assets are a bit more slow than yours. This is like large infrastructure that take a lot of years to move, and then when they happen, it is like magic. So I think for me, most satisfaction I have is to go to a country and see, like 10 years ago, there was nothing. And now we funded this power plant and it's changed lives around the power plant or made a big difference. So it's really nice to go and you can feel and touch what you invested in and really see the big impact, development impact you've seen. So I really love it. And I really enjoy every moment of doing it. I think the learning, I would say work-life balance, you know, we always think that if we work, we need to work this 12 hours. So yes, there are times you need to work 12 hours and I will expect my team to work 12 hours and there's time I want them to relax and de-stress, because if you just work too many hours, you will collapse. And, you know, this is not good for anyone. So I think for me, it's very important to learn sometimes to say, it's important for me to do something else. I can give a real life example. I'm closing a large deal of $70 million this week, and I'm the one who negotiates everything. And I've been on back-to-back calls for 14 hours, but I told them this hour of the panel, you can all find something else to do. I'm doing this panel. I want to do it. I care about it. You can wait. And when I was young, never would say that. So just say sometime it's okay. We can take a break of an hour. Now my head is clear on, and I can go back and negotiate this deal better. But I just think, you know, don't be scared sometimes to put your own stops, because that's the most difficult thing I think to do as a young professional.
I think it's a completely undersold attribute of our industry. Again, the flexibility of the job, the working hours. You know, I've got all my friends, they're bankers and lawyers, and you know they're working all hours, all weekends. You know, I love my job, but I want to have a life too. I want to see my wife, my friends, my kids, go to their plays, go in sports days, and you know, go out for dinner, go out for drinks, and not have to, you know, say sorry guys, I can't. You know, there's a deal tonight. You know, you've hopefully seen behind me, that's not just due to COVID. You know, the floor is empty, and it has been for the last hour because everyone goes home at 6. Actually, everyone can have a life. And that's one of the great things about you know, having a job in fund management. There's some additional strains and stresses that come with having a portfolio and living that day in, day out, and every year. Don't get me wrong, there's some pros and cons to being a fund manager, but the flexibility and control you have over your schedule is fantastic, especially as you get older, and especially as that flexibility and control becomes so much more important as you're sort of balancing that with other parts of your life. So that's the thing that I love about it. In terms of tips, you know, I think the biggest adjustment I see is, you know, you specialize more and more and more in academia, and you're used to getting, you know, top grades all the time. And then you get into investing, and you know, if you're more than 50% right, you're doing a pretty good job. And especially when you're younger, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, but you've got to be willing to make those mistakes. That's the only way you learn. I would encourage you to get access to actually investing capital as quickly as possible and learn from those mistakes, and realize that you're going to get it wrong a lot, but then learn from that. Don't be kind of sort of so head in the sand or intellectually kind of, I cannot admit that I'm wrong, that you got that one wrong. You know, leverage the experience around you. There are lots of people who are going to help you, but take that opportunity, learn from those mistakes, and you'll be a much better investor for it down the line.